All right, welcome to the first live stream of the FAI Wire. We're going to call it the Live Wire. Clever name. We'll see how this goes. A little bit of an experiment going on here as we foray into live streaming on YouTube for the first time. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. I see we've got about 60 people on, and who we got? Let's do roll call. Canada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Jungle Jerry in Arkansas. Hey, Emily. Jake Nuding's on. He's close to where I am here in California. So, all right, hopefully you all can hear me okay. I'm going to keep myself muted so I don't do the whole like audio loop thing. And we're going to get started. Nova Scotia. How you doing, Nova Scotia? Toodaloo. Delaware. Wow. Indiana, Vancouver, Hong Kong. How's it going? All right. Well, we are going to do some. Hey, Kentucky. We are going to do some questions in a little bit. First, I wanted to do just a brief recap of the events that have been transpiring over about the last. Since last Wednesday, I'd say it is when Operation Grim Beeper, as it's called, was executed. If you have been following along with The Wire or the news, or just haven't been living in a cave for the past week, you are aware that Israel began executing what I'd say is its master stroke in this whole war since the very beginning, since October 7th. And that is, it finally cashed in on a very long game, a very methodically planned out operation that began with a pager or telecom manufacturing company in Hungary, which was really a front for Israeli intelligence. And years ago, they began advertising manufactured pagers, their own proprietary brand of pagers. This was before October 7th, before Hamas kidnapped over 200 Israeli civilians, and before the war in Gaza started. So incredible foresight on Israel's part. At the time, it was already understood that in the event of any kind of major conflict, and even prior to any major conflict, that most of Iran's proxies, such as Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Hamas, would know better than to use any kind of cellular device that had any kind of GPS radio in it. So that would include smartphones. And so with that foresight, they began planning to manufacture these pagers. We don't know all what was in the pagers at this point. We know that Israel was building them from scratch, which means they could basically put whatever they wanted in it as long as it wasn't too heavy or didn't make any weird noises or appear strange on the outside. And eventually they got a contract with Hezbollah. That was their gold star client for years, or at least for months. We know at least earlier this year they began putting in orders for these pagers and have been having them shipped to them for months. So when the decision was made a few months ago, Israel had already built into the pagers a certain amount of explosive powder, which is very lightweight. PTN. I'm not an explosives expert. I'm not a chemist, so I can't describe that to you. Maybe somebody on the live stream can give you more information about that. But essentially, it was only like 20 grams of this stuff that was inside the pager. Very small amount. So didn't really weigh anymore. And Hezbollah operatives were none the wiser when they clipped on the pagers. And not only we know now where they're pagers, but also radios that had this lightweight powder explosive inside of it. And along with that, the Israelis had developed some kind of software that would essentially, when they sent the command to the pager, when they sent a literal page to the pager, would, I'm sorry guys, I'm having a buffering issue here. Hopefully you all can hear me. Okay, so essentially what had happened is once the IDF sent the page to the pagers, and apparently they did this individually with over 4,000 pagers that had been distributed to 1,000 commanders. Once they had done that, they just sent the page. And the software that they sent, probably a command to the firmware of the pager itself, caused the battery to overheat. Once the battery overheated, it ignited the explosive powder and created that sort of shaped charge that many of you saw on the videos that were posted to social media from Israel. Okay, I'll keep going here now. Looks like we've got a better connection. Sorry about that, guys. I am back. Not sure what happened there. We have a dedicated connection for this live stream, but it looks like we might have had some kind of issue there with connectivity for a few minutes. So, to continue on, the pager explosions, Operation Grim Beeper, happened on Wednesday. The very next day, there were several hundred exploding two-way radios. The next day after that, as Hezbollah figured out it couldn't communicate through electronic means anymore, it decided that it was going to go ahead and meet in person. So you had the entire leadership of the Radwan unit, which is its sole purpose when it was created was to plan for and execute an invasion of northern Israel, sort of a October 7th on steroids. And then as that leadership was meeting in downtown Beirut, the IDF, the Israeli Air Force, conducted an airstrike and took out the entire leadership of the Radwan Air Force, or of the Radwan unit, as well as the second in command of the Hezbollah militia. So an incredible event, series of events over the last few days or so that really demonstrate the fact that Israel has completely compromised Hezbollah's command structure from top to bottom, and has been able to infiltrate it through signals intelligence, through human intelligence, through many different means. And Hezbollah almost can't scratch their nose without members of the Israeli Defense Forces seeing it and hearing it at this point. So that's kind of where we ended up over the weekend with Hezbollah, is Hezbollah was in a position where it was completely compromised. It attempted to mount a response to the IDF strike against Radwan by bombing the Ramat David air base near Nazareth, which is an Arab majority area of the central Galilee. The IDF obviously was aware of that ahead of time and immediately took out all of their rocket launchers and their rocket tubes as they were preparing to fire, and took out several hundred rocket launchers, several thousand tubes, because there's about a dozen or more tubes per launcher. So at this point, Hezbollah is completely frustrated, completely neutralized. And over the weekend, you just had these kinds of separate rounds of attempts to retaliate against Israel however possible, and Israel basically preemptively stopping Hezbollah from even being able to get any rockets off the ground. We had a few volleys over the weekend, again towards that air base, 20, 30 rockets. And so at that point, by Sunday evening in Israel, it was just very clear that it was time for the gloves to come off. And that's exactly what happened. So that's when all that sort of chatter went out from different state departments and foreign ministries across the world telling their citizens to get out of Lebanon, that war was imminent. That's when Israel had really amassed its ground forces along the border. At this point, they haven't crossed the border yet, but they are there. And on Sunday, you could say all hell broke loose in southern Lebanon. Sunday evening and going into Monday morning. So at this point, we're looking at, within the last 24 hours, over 1,800 Israeli airstrikes against targets across southern Lebanon. Thousands of Hezbollah rockets and launchers have been struck. Keep in mind that Hezbollah, it's estimated, has anywhere between 150 to 150,000 rockets and missiles, some of those longer range missiles that can reach anywhere inside the territory of Israel, of the state of Israel. And besides that, the IDF leadership claims that it has a list of over 10,000 targets that it can strike in the coming days. So even with thousands of airstrikes already in southern Lebanon, according to the IDF, we're just starting to scratch the surface of what this war is going to look like. And so we'll see how things continue to unfold over the next few days. Hezbollah has fired approximately 200 to 300 rockets into northern Israel so far, mostly around the Haifa area, a few volleys into the Tel Aviv area and its suburbs earlier today. Acre, those are all coastal cities in northern and central Israel. Again, around the Ramat David Air Base in Nazareth, northern Golan Heights, and a few other places. So Israel's methodically kind of carrying out this plan. And I've been sharing some of the memes that we found from the Godfather movies to kind of illustrate what Israel is doing right now. And that's really, I think, the appropriate description of what's happening is if you've seen the Godfather films, you know Michael Corleone has these plans throughout the films that he kind of executes at the end of the movies. Execute, no pun intended, where he kind of takes out all of his enemies at once. And he's been sort of methodically planning these assassinations throughout the film. He kind of gets everybody right where he wants them, and then he kind of sends out his button men and starts executing his plan. That's the best analogy I can think of to describe what's happening in Lebanon right now, is that the IDF has been planning Operation Beeper. It's been compromising Hezbollah systemically, structurally, from the bottom up or from the top down for years, if not months already. And it's just been a matter of time, especially as we see operations winding down in the Gaza Strip right now. It's just been a matter of time until it started to execute its plan. So Hezbollah leadership is completely decimated at this point. I shared a graphic where all but two of Hezbollah's senior leadership appear to have been assassinated just within the last week or so. Hassan Nasrallah, the chairman of Hezbollah at the top, whether Israel has intentionally left him alive or not is up for debate, but he is still alive. And at least one other mid-level member of the senior leadership is still alive. Otherwise, they're all dead. Operation Beeper took out almost 300 mid-level commanders in Hezbollah over the past few days. And then, obviously, Hezbollah had already suffered over 500 casualties in the kind of war of attrition that's been taking place along the border since October 7th in the last 11 months. So Hezbollah is in a bad position, and it remains to be seen right now whether the IDF plans to cross the border with ground forces. They're certainly poised to do so. My guess is there are some pretty intense back-channel negotiations going on right now that involve the United States, that involves France, being that Lebanon was a former French colony, that involves the Lebanese government, and obviously the state of Israel. So right now, Israel appears to be placing as much pressure on Hezbollah as it possibly can in order to put itself in a good position for negotiations. What those negotiations will be, in order to avoid a ground operation, we can't assume anything yet. I would say it would probably need to at least include Hezbollah's compliance with United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, which requires there to be no armed groups in southern Lebanon south of the Litani River, which is a few dozen kilometers north of the Lebanese-Israeli border. So if Hezbollah were to withdraw across the Litani River, it's possible that there might be an avoidance of some kind of ground operation at this point. But that doesn't necessarily prevent Hezbollah from firing their missiles into most of northern and central Israel. That can still, and they can do that from anywhere in Lebanon and still hit most of Israel. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's safe for over 60,000 Israelis to return home to the northern Galilee either. So the politics that are going on behind the scenes, we don't really know what those negotiations are or what the outcome of them will be, other than we can safely assume that they are happening at a rapid pace right now. So otherwise, the situation on the ground is Israel clearly has a strong advantage. Hezbollah is clearly on its heels, if just not knocked down on its tuchus, and just isn't in a position to mount a large-scale response to Israel right now. The last estimate I saw that the IDF is saying is 50% of Hezbollah's missile arsenal has been compromised. That's, if you're talking 100,000 missiles and rockets, that's 50,000. So that's a major blow to Hezbollah. Keep in mind that Hezbollah has been building its strength with the help of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps for the last 20 years since the last war, the second Israeli-Lebanese war in 2006, which is only a month long, had far fewer casualties than what we've seen so far since October 7th along that border. And it was a costly war for the IDF going into southern Lebanon on the ground, only because that's a very mountainous terrain. And you can bet whatever Hamas is doing in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah is doing, and that much more so, because they have more money. They are really, in some ways, the favorite child, the trump card in the proxy portfolio of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So they get kind of first pick at weapons and financing, and have had this really close coordination with the RGC in developing precision-guided missiles. And so the types of tunnel complexes that we saw under Gaza that were like 5 times longer all put together than the New York City subway, you can bet it's at least that and a lot more in southern Lebanon. It's rugged terrain, it's mountainous terrain. And most of their missile batteries are mobile and probably ensconced in mountainsides and are difficult to hit. So nonetheless, though, Israel has plenty of targets, according to the IDF. With the airstrikes today, so far, the Lebanese Ministry of Health has reported, I think it was something like 170 casualties. I have not seen differentiation in their statistics between combatants and civilians, claiming at least several women and children were killed as well. That, unfortunately, is going to be a reality of this war, is that Israel is not going to be able to take the same kinds of precautionary measures with civilians, allowing time to evacuate and knocking on the roof and making phone calls to the apartment building before you level it, the kinds of things that they did with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The IDF is going to have to act a little bit more aggressively against Hezbollah just because of the scope of that conflict. And so, unfortunately, what that means is that will have ramifications for civilians in southern Lebanon. So that is definitely something for us to be praying about for the people of southern Lebanon. And that they would heed the warnings that the IDF is putting out to get away from Hezbollah sites. Hezbollah, of course, has ensconced themselves in apartment complexes and businesses and schools, and they have the same MO as Hamas, which is to lure the IDF into committing as many civilian casualties as possible in order to turn the court of public opinion against Israel as quickly as possible. So over the past 24 hours or so, Israel has been warning Lebanese civilians by text message, by radio announcements, I would imagine by other means as well that we may not even know about. And we already see thousands of Lebanese civilians fleeing to northern Lebanon, fleeing across the border to Syria, which is a massive irony considering the fact that something like 2 million Syrians have over the course of the Syrian civil war have fled across the other border from the other direction. There's still hundreds of thousands, over 1 million Syrian civilians in Lebanese refugee camps right now. And the fact that you now have Lebanese civilians fleeing into Syria is just, it's another one of those things that if you had told us this a year ago, we would have said you're crazy, but yet here we are. Another telling thing to point out is Iran's silence in this. Their silence has been deafening. Other than their usual bluster and their word vomit on their social media channels and on their state television, Iran has done nothing to respond to Israel's actions over the past couple of days. That is very telling in understanding the dynamics of this conflict. That you may remember a couple months ago, after Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was the leader of Hamas. He lived in Qatar. He was handling kind of all the negotiations with all the parties over the Gaza war. He traveled to Tehran, the capital of Iran, and somebody took him out with a bomb in his apartment. So Iran, the Iranian regime, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps swore a response, retaliation against Israel after that, and then backed off. And then about a week later, it was another, Iranian missile launches are imminent, and everybody was hunkering down again and thinking, here we go. And then they backed off again. And again, we don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes. We know that for all their crazy, apocalyptic, cultish talk and theology, that the Iranian regime is also practical. They're careful not to put themselves in a position to, number one, lead to the destruction of their nuclear sites. That's really their ace in the hole, is developing a nuclear weapon. So first of all, they don't want to do anything that would provoke, especially the United States, because the United States, more than anyone, even more than the state of Israel, has weapons capability to take those sites out that are deep in the Iranian mountains, Zagros Mountains. But even beyond that, the Iranian regime is so unstable. So many different ethnic groups and religious groups within Iran. Almost half of Iran is not Persian, Shia Persian. And we've seen an increase among the different minority groups within Iran to push towards autonomy. The Baluchs are one, the Kurds are another. And just in general, the regime is massively unpopular. We've talked about this a lot on The Wire. And if you've watched Sheep Among Wolves too, you know from the mouths of Iranians themselves that 80 to 90% of the population of that country, 81 million people, so we're talking, 70 million, 65, 70 million people hate their government and have been intimidated and bullied and abused into silence repeatedly. But that doesn't change the fact that they have no love for the regime. And the regime knows this, and the regime, the Iranian regime knows it's in a very precarious position. And so all of this factors, and not to mention now, you've got at least 2, maybe 3, and with one more on the way, U.S. Naval Carrier Strike Group in the theater, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea. Who knows what's under the water in terms of American and other NATO naval assets. So Iran knows this, and when it comes down to it, they may yet intervene, so they may yet prove me wrong, but so far we have not seen any kind of serious intervention by the Iranian regime against Israel since this, what's now being called Operation Northern Arrows, began really kicked into gear about 24 hours ago. So how are we doing? Am I still with you guys? Are you still with me? Hopefully you can see and hear me. Give me a shout out. So at this point, I will go ahead and start taking some questions. If you guys, good. Glad to see that. If you guys have some specific questions for me, primarily, obviously, the topic of the day, the soup du jour, is the new Israeli operation in southern Lebanon. But if you have questions about other topics around the region, our wheelhouse, obviously, here at FAI is the Middle East. So I can try my best to answer your Middle East questions. Otherwise, I'm not so good with topics like Ukraine or Donald Trump or other things that people like to talk about. So hit me with your best shot. Fire away. Did FAI have enough opportunity to upgrade bomb shelters in the north? Yes. Obviously not as many as we would have liked to. But your generosity, we had a lot of generosity over the past year. And thankfully 11 months where there was this sort of global focus on this conflict, where we were able to generate a lot of interest in that project. And so because of that, because of your generous donations, we have continued renovating bomb shelters in northern Israel. I think I shared at one point there's something like 50,000 people or more in northern Israel that don't have access to an adequate bomb shelter. So that has been our, what we're doing is maybe in some ways a drop in the bucket. More importantly, is it's giving us opportunity to serve our Israeli neighbors and build relationships with them. So obviously Kiryat Shmona is one place that we've done that, and we've talked publicly about our relationship with that city. And then there are other cities, other places in northern Israel where we've both been renovating bomb shelters and where we have also been providing some supplies and relief to IDF units that are deployed there. Good question. Any inkling on what Turkey is thinking about during this time? Interesting question. So Turkey's relationship with the Iranian regime, like everything else in the Middle East, is complex and it's layered. So Israel or Turkey and Iran work together in some things and work against each other in some other things. They're on opposite sides of the Syrian civil war. The Iranian regime and Hezbollah have propped up the Assad regime in Syria, where Turkey has been supporting the rebels that are fighting against the Syrian regime. Places like Iraqi Kurdistan, they haven't directly coordinated together publicly, but they certainly have been coordinating together behind the scenes in terms of Turkey going after what it considers to be its Kurdish enemies, the PKK, in northwest of Iraqi Kurdistan, where you've got Iran going after Kurdish militants, Kurdish separatists Iranian Kurdish separatists in eastern Iraqi Kurdistan. So there's places where they are against each other. There's places where they work together. In general, in Israel, obviously, with Hamas, Iran is the top patron of Hamas. Turkey is, I'd say, as far as within the region, with the exception of maybe Qatar, is the other top patron of Hamas in terms of hosting members of Hamas, even at one point in sharing intelligence with them. So in the Gaza war, their messages have been very much in sync with one another. It remains to be seen with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not a Sunni militia like Hamas. Hezbollah is a Shia militia. Iran is a Shiite Twelver regime, so a Shia regime that generally supports Shia militias around the Middle East, in Syria and in Yemen like the Houthis, and in southern Lebanon like Hezbollah. The OG proxy of Shia proxy of Iran is Hezbollah, born and raised in the 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War. So Turkey is Sunni. So Turkey has absolutely no problem working with Hamas, which was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni, we could call it a jihadist Islamist organization. Turkey's relationship with Hezbollah is a little less clear, only because Turkey's proxies fought directly against Hezbollah and are still fighting against Hezbollah, or squared off against Hezbollah in Syria. So I would imagine we would see at some point some kind of statement from Erdogan to condemn Israel, because he's not going to ever miss an opportunity to condemn Israel and to portray himself as the savior of the Muslim world. It's a little different dynamic though. With the Palestinian populations of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, Erdogan wants to be their daddy, right? And he has made an intentional effort. If you go to East Jerusalem today, I was there not that long ago, and every year I've been there since 2018, there has been a presence of the Turkish government in East Jerusalem, even in the old city. And you ask your average East Jerusalemite on the street, what do you think of Recep Tayyip Erdogan? And 8 times out of 10, I guess that'd be 4 times out of 5, 4 out of 5 people will tell you, oh, he's great. Yeah, we love that guy. He's there for us. So Erdogan is very much wants to be the father, the protector of the Palestinian people, because they're stateless, right? And Mahmoud Abbas is in his 80s and a very weak leader who doesn't really have, the Palestinians don't have a unified government, a unified leader. So he likes to fill that role. It's a little different with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is inside a you could say, at least it's a technically functioning state. The government of Lebanon is in a lot of political and economic trouble right now. Still don't have a duly elected prime minister. Their economy is entirely in the toilet, and we're seeing a lot of fracturing along the same lines of Lebanese society that we saw in the 1950s or 1970s that led to the Lebanese Civil War. Nonetheless, Lebanon is still a functioning government for now. And so it's a little bit of a different dynamic there for Turkey to jump into it. If you've been following The Wire, you know that there are many segments of Lebanese society that can't stand Hezbollah. Maronite Christians, one of them. Many Sunni factions as well. And being that in the sectarian divide, Erdogan would almost always fall on the side of the Sunnis, he's going to be a little bit more hesitant to really throw in with Hezbollah. So we'll wait and see what he says. Could be something a little more general, like Israel's committing genocide in Lebanon now, or whatever he's going to come up with. But in terms of inviting Hezbollah leadership, inviting Hassan Nasrallah to Istanbul or whatever, that's not going to happen. So, good question. Do I think this conflict will be swift or drawn out for a long time? There will be portions of it that are swift, and that will be by Israel's design to go into Lebanon, either in the air and on the ground, in order to take out as much of Hezbollah's missile arsenal as possible. That is going to probably happen fairly quickly. In terms of what comes after that in southern Lebanon, in terms of ground operation, I don't think it'll be protracted, only because Israel doesn't want. Israel spent almost 20 years between the mid 80s all the way to 2000 occupying southern Lebanon, and pulled out in 2000, and then that led to a war, and they went back in for a month, and it was just. It's not desirable, let's say, for the IDF to have an occupation force in Lebanon for any longer than it has to. So I imagine they're going to go in there, try to take care of business as quickly as possible, and get out. And what happens after that, we have yet to see. Maybe the plan is to weaken Hezbollah as much as possible so that the Lebanese government, the Lebanese military, is actually finally in a position to occupy and to have the sole authority of southern Lebanon, sole political authority of southern Lebanon. We'll see. It'll be something that will have to involve the Lebanese government, because that's the legitimate ruling authority in that country. And so if the plan is to get in and get out as quickly as possible, then whatever negotiations are going on behind the scenes right now probably include the day after kind of scenario. Israel has defanged Hamas and Hezbollah now. Iran is suing for peace. Will they use this opportunity to change the status quo? That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because the status quo is, if we're talking about the status quo on the Temple Mount since 1967, the status quo has always been, according to Israeli law, that Israel has political and security control of the Temple Mount, and the Jordanian Waqf, the religious leader of Jordan, has religious control of the Temple Mount. So if you go up on the Temple Mount today, you'll see Israeli border police up there, because that part of Jerusalem is at a border between West and East Jerusalem. So you'll see Israeli security forces up there, but you'll see Jordanian Waqf officers, I guess you could call them. They walk around with their walkie-talkies, but they're not armed, and they're keeping an eye on everybody. And the status quo, according to the Waqf, is that only Muslims are allowed to express any kind of religious observance up on the Temple Mount. So only Muslims can pray, only Muslims can sing, only Muslims can do anything, bow or do anything that appears to be religious. Jews and Christians are not allowed to do that. So you get instructions, especially groups of Jews when they go up on the Temple Mount under guard, are given instructions that when you're up there, don't sing, don't close your eyes and talk and look like you're praying, don't kneel, all that kind of stuff. Now that is officially the status quo. What I have personally seen on more than one occasion on the Temple Mount is border guard escorts surrounding a group of Jewish worshipers, looking on as those Jewish worshipers are praying and chanting from the Siddur. That is a newer development over the last few years. And, the Waqf guys came running all around and were recording the whole thing for the cell phone. And it actually got kind of tense for a minute. I kind of backed up and I wasn't sure where that was going to go. But then it just kind of, they got done and they left and it all kind of dispersed. But it appears, at least at the operational level, if not at the legal strategic level, that Israel is allowing its citizens unofficially to worship on the Temple Mount. And it's just kind of looking the other way. And as I said, I saw that twice. So that to me is indicative of the shift in Israeli culture. In one of our articles where we talked about the change in Israeli demography, you've got this increasing population of both ultra-Orthodox Jews and what we would call religious Zionists. Ultra-Orthodox Jews generally don't serve in the IDF, although that law is now changing as well. But you've also got religious Zionist Jews who live in the West Bank. They're mostly West Bank settlers, many of them on what we would call, the international press would call illegal settlements. Really, they're just unregistered with the Israeli government. And they are very military. They have no problem serving in the Israeli military or in the Israeli government. And so as more and more religious Zionists emigrate to Israel and have lots of children, as ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidim, have more and more children, then you've got this increasing percentage of the Israeli population that is religious, that are religious Jews. And so that is now reflected in the Israeli government. You've got an increasing proportion of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, that represents ultra-Orthodox parties, such as Shah's and far-right Zionist parties, such as Ben Gvir's party, who literally, unfortunately, I wouldn't say worship, they have venerated, they have canonized men who committed literal terrorist acts against Palestinians in the West Bank, killed Palestinian men, women, and children in shooting attacks and bombings. So that's kind of the dark side of religious Zionism. It's a reality in Israel, and you've got a couple of those guys, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, in the Israeli cabinet. So Ben Gvir's over the internal security forces, the police force of Israel. So those guys certainly want Jewish worship on the Temple Mount. They want their temple rebuilt. And so where I think this comes into play is as Bibi's government, Bibi is a conservative, his Likud party is conservative, but more secular. They're not, the party itself is not an expressly religious party. So they look at this with a little bit more of a geostrategic viewpoint than a religious viewpoint. But as Bibi is continuing to negotiate behind the scenes with the Saudi royal family, which I'm sure he would consider to be his crowning achievement, and is hanging on to office as long as possible to be able to sign that agreement with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. As MBS has said, he wants at least a pathway to a Palestinian state, sort of a Oslo Accords 2.0, to be part of that normalization agreement. And I don't see any way that the current Israeli cabinet would accept that, especially post-October 7th. In fact, most of the Israeli populace, most of the Israeli public probably wouldn't accept that. One thing that could make that kind of thing palatable would be a change in the status quo on the Temple Mount, I believe. I don't know exactly when or how this will happen, but such a deal for a Palestinian state could be made more palatable if Jews are given the ability to not only openly worship on the Temple Mount, but resume the Levitical sacrifices on the Temple Mount. That would be a game changer. So whether it happens with the Saudi deal or some other point, we know at some point it's going to happen. The prophet Daniel is clear about that. And then also, by extension, Jesus, who quotes the prophet Daniel in Matthew 24. So we know it's coming. We don't know exactly how, but that's just one scenario in which we can see plausibly a change in the status quo. And whether that's going to come out of the end of this war is yet to be seen. I've learned the lesson the hard way not to make predictions. Have we heard from Stephanie? Yes. Talking to her often. If you're on X, she's on X, you can follow her. So she's been posting updates pretty much daily now. But yeah, we are chatting back and forth with her behind the scenes. She and Patty are safe and sound at the moment. Thanks for asking. She is at home in the north, in the Golan Heights. Pretty safe to assume that Iran is surrounding Israel with all their proxies so they aren't just getting the bullies to say what they want to say, or am I not understanding that correctly? Yeah, so again, Iran's strategy is to fight against Israel indirectly. Instead of going to war with Israel, which would be very difficult for Iran to do, okay, because they're separated by several countries and several hundred kilometers. Not to mention Iran's army, its ground forces, its air force, and its navy are all vastly inferior to Israel's. Obviously, its intelligence, military intelligence, is vastly inferior as well, because Israel has managed to sabotage nuclear sites by different means and assassinate the leader of Hamas and assassinate nuclear scientists inside Iran, and even killed the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or helped the United States to do so in Baghdad in 2020. And Iran hasn't been able to stop them. So Iran has avoided direct conflict, a direct war with Israel. Really, all Iran has to its name are its ballistic and cruise missile arsenal, which, if it unleashed it all at once, could overwhelm Israeli air defenses and cause a lot of damage. So that's for certain, and they know that. But then it's game over if they did that. Their nuclear site's gone. Regime would be even further destabilized, may not survive. So they've indirectly fought against Israel through their proxies. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Houthis. There are Iranian-sponsored militias, the Popular Mobilization Forces in northern Iraq that have been firing missiles and drones into Israel. Of course, they've got their proxies in Syria as well. You could call Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, an Iranian proxy himself. And Iran's getting closer and closer to co-opting the Iraqi government as well. So that has been their strategy. They've been playing the long game, and so far things have gone pretty well for them. Things are not going very well for their proxies so far. So although Hezbollah was the IRGC's favorite child, proxy child, you could say, they're not gonna risk their regime over Hezbollah. And so far, Hezbollah's response has been they've gotten a few missiles through the Iron Dome. I think they hit a Palestinian house in the West Bank, south of the Sea of Galilee, and injured a couple of Palestinian men. There have been a few minor injuries I saw along the Israeli border. A few fires set in Arab neighborhoods, again, not Jewish Israeli, but in Arab neighborhoods around Nazareth when they were trying to hit Ramat David air base. So unfortunately, Iran just has to sit back and watch it all go up in smoke. But we may not even be to the apex of this thing yet. We're probably just seeing the start of it, and it's going to ramp up over the next few days and possibly weeks. And so we'll see if and when Iran decides to step in and do anything. A question I have is, how do you foresee Iran playing a pivotal role in the Beast Empire despite the Islamic regime being so unpopular? Excellent question. Unfortunately, I do not have an answer for you. I don't know if the Iranian regime will even exist anymore at that point as it exists. In fact, I don't even know if the nation of Iran with its current borders will exist at that point. We know the region of the Middle East from which the man of sin will come, because Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel all point to that kind of region of the Middle East around Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq. So we know he's probably going to come from somewhere in there. What the nations, the geopolitical nations, will look like at that point, where their borders will be, what their governments will be, we just don't know. We're always in the Middle East just one big war away from everything changing. And just like everything changed at the end of World War I, The map was completely redrawn. The dynamics completely changed after World War II, the beginning of the Cold War. The dynamics in the Middle East completely changed. You had regimes there's a massive turnover in regimes from the sort of European aligned monarchies to the Arab nationalist secularist governments like Nasser in Egypt and Saddam Hussein and Iraq and the Assads and Syria. And then after the Arab Spring in 2011, you had the same thing. You had the overthrow of those dictators and the beginning of civil wars and those countries being balkanized into pieces. We're just one war away from things looking completely different. And I wish I had a better answer, but I just don't at this point. That is definitely a wait and see. But good question. Is it pretty safe to assume that Iran is surrounding Israel with all their proxies? Oh, I already read that one. Sorry. I guess I'm reading them out of order. How is the focus going to deal with the situation in Lebanon going to impact getting the hostages back? Good question. Also unforeseen and unknown. Hamas is just as much on the ropes as Hezbollah. You might have seen a couple days ago, Israel's trying to figure out if Yahya Sinwar is even still alive. He's apparently not been in contact with Hamas leadership in Qatar for a few days, subsequent to an IDF airstrike. So he may not even be alive. It may be unclear even who to negotiate with to get hostages back at this point. I don't know that Hamas necessarily cares what Israel's doing in southern Lebanon, other than it distracts attention away from Gaza, and they aren't the center of attention anymore, which is both good and bad in different ways for them. Israel's already committed to doing whatever it needs to do to get the hostages back. There are still residual forces inside the Gaza Strip along the Netzarim corridor, along the Philadelphia corridor that is along the border with Egypt, and the Netzarim corridor bisects about the middle of the Gaza Strip. It cuts off Gaza City from the southern part of the Strip, Khan Yunis and Rafah. So Hamas is in a bad position right now. There's Israeli forces based all over the Strip, and they're completely compromised as well. So my guess is at this point is Israel's doing it whatever it can to find the remaining surviving hostages. Because remember, Hamas doesn't even control all of the hostages. Some of them were taken and are being held by Islamic Jihad, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad don't always get along together. Some of them were taken by quote-unquote Gazan civilians, men who came in and took women, and Hamas may not even necessarily know where they are. So Hamas never really was, and is definitely not today, a good negotiating partner. And are just probably not even in a good position to be able to offer anything at this point. And they never were really serious about that. In the first place, offering to give back dead hostages who Israel knew were still alive at the time, and that kind of clued the Israeli government into the fact that Hamas had no intention of returning hostages alive, and if they wanted them back alive, that they're going to have to do their best to rescue them. So my guess is that continues on as before in Gaza, and we'll see what happens. Do I expect a response from Hezbollah? We've been waiting a long time for their capabilities and their huge arsenal and stockpile. Yes, I expect them to continue to attempt to respond. They've already attempted to respond several times and were preemptively slapped down. And so what do they have up their sleeve that they haven't used yet remains to be seen. They certainly have at least half of their rocket and missile arsenal left. Are they just going to pull the plug on the whole thing and let them all go? Very possibly. My guess would be at whatever point it looks like Israel's either coming in on the ground, could be when all bets are off and they push all in. Could be when the Israeli air campaign reaches kind of its critical mass and it looks like they better use them before they lose them. That's when we could see the really big push to push everything across the border. Hezbollah is not in a position to mount any kind of ground resistance at this point. They've got, 1,000 of their guys are dead, and well over 1,000, 2,000 of their guys are blind or missing their private parts, or are otherwise laid up maimed in the hospital, missing fingers and parts of their hip. So they're just not in a position. I mean, their top leadership is completely decimated. Their mid-level leadership is gutted. And so really at this point, they're probably just trying to hang on as much as possible and weather the storm over the next few days and respond with their missile arsenal. So yeah, I would guess, Emily, that they do have a few things up their sleeve that they would use if Israel came across the border. Or if they felt like it was at the point where they have to use them or lose them. Any new news on Iran's president forming the Arab coalition against Israel, which they were vocal about, but now say we don't want war? Good question, Victoria. So, yeah, that's the Middle East for you, is hurry up and wait. So there's this big push a couple of weeks ago, I think, that began a couple of weeks ago, which is what Victoria is referring to, where several leaders in the Middle East, especially President Erdogan in Turkey, started calling for a coalition of Muslim nations against Israel. And this really began after, in the wake of the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, but even more fervently in the past couple of weeks. And if that's actually going to begin to form into what would look like a 10-nation coalition, that would be very interesting to keep an eye on. Those nations all coordinate to some degree or other already against Israel, despite their competitions with one another. So could we see something like an alliance, a confederation of Turkey and Iraq and Syria and Iran against Israel? Sure. There are some things that would need to get ironed out first. First of all, Turkey still technically doesn't have diplomatic relations with Syria. They would have to bury the hatchet there first, and that would probably involve Erdogan making some concessions to Bashar al-Assad that would basically betray his proxies in northern Syria, and might involve him having to pull out of the Kurdish territories of Rojava as well, and respect the territorial integrity of the nation of Syria. So those negotiations are ongoing right now, and that's been out in the news. Turkey's deal with the Iraqi government, the Iraqi government's displeasure with Turkey's military activity in Iraqi Kurdistan, the presence of U.S. forces, still a small contingent, but there's still U.S. forces, about 2,500 military personnel in Iraq, and about between 800 and 1,000 in eastern Syria. All of those factor into the ability of those nations to be able to act in coordination with each other. There is, the fact that it's being talked about publicly by leaders of several nations in the Middle East means it's something we probably should perk up our ears at and pay attention to, and see how that might materialize into something tangible over the next few days and weeks. How best can people help Israel right now? Well, I'd say intercessory prayer is the most important thing that we can be doing right now. Going to the throne of Almighty God is the most important thing we can do right now. And some of this is not my will, but yours be done. I know what I'd like to see happen. But the Lord's sovereign plan is unfolding. And so we just kind of have to wait and see how things unfold. But I I don't think it's wrong to ask the Lord for his hedge of protection around both the people of Israel and the security forces of Israel and the people of southern Lebanon. I don't think it's wrong to ask that his people, the workers of the harvest, the field laborers, would be positioned in such a way in both Israel and Lebanon to be able to be light and salt to the people around them throughout this war. And we want, obviously, as it's in our organization, to see both Isaac and Ishmael come to know the saving power of their Messiah, Jesus. So that is absolutely something to pray for. We can be praying that the lies of the enemy would be restrained and the truth of God would be revealed in all these things in the media and for sympathetic leaders in the international, in the table of nations. Beyond that, practically speaking, might be a hard time to go to Israel. Might not get in or out very well right now, and unfortunately, if you're an American or a Westerner, you're just kind of a liability as long as you're there, for the most part, unless you're plugged in with somebody. So the other thing, I mean, obviously, and this is not a shameless plug. I'm not ashamed at all to plug this, but if you go to, I think it's FAI.online/donate, there is a button there you can click on to give to our Israel Fund. And just as much as we've been utilizing that fund over the past 11 months to help the people of northern Israel, now much more so, as the war that we've all been waiting for is beginning to unfold. So I would highly encourage all of you, if you can, to jump on board with what we're doing in Israel. Obviously, we're not the only Christian nonprofit that's at work in Israel. There are plenty of others. But I'm a little biased, and I know what we're doing, and I love our people, and we just have these great connections with the IDF that go all the way back to our work in southern Syria during Operation Good Neighbor. We have great relationships with our friends in northern Galilee, in the Hula Valley, and in the Golan Heights. And so we really want to continue to support them as much as we can. And it really does make a big difference when we are able to tell them, and you've probably seen some of the videos that Steph and Marco and Susan did after some of the bomb shelters were renovated, where they made it clear to the representatives of those localities, those municipalities, that these projects are being funded by Christians, by followers of Jesus who love them and who care about them. That means a lot. Israelis are typically a very self-sufficient people, and that is a character that's been forged over the last century of existential wars and other crises that they've oftentimes felt alone in the world. So I don't know that any of them would admit that they need our help, but in dire times like this, I know that it's much appreciated and it makes a big impact. So FAI.online/donate, click the Israel Fund button and give what you can. And I'm sure that Steph and Marco are going to have some, right now they're kind of hunkered down and sheltered in place, obviously, but as much as possible in the coming days, they're going to give you updates on the ground there and continue to share new ways that you can be participating with us and sewing into this work with us. Pretty safe to assume that Iran is surrounding itself with other proxies, so they aren't just getting, I already read that. How? Don, you just had such a great question. My eyes just keep going back to it over and over again, I guess. How best can people help Israel right now? Kelly, is your sense that Iran is willing to let Hezbollah be destroyed rather than risk intervention and direct confrontation with Israel? More likely than not, yes. I already addressed that, so I won't belabor the point again, but more likely than not, Iran is not going to go toe-to-toe with Israel in the octagon, so to speak, over Hezbollah. We might see some tepid responses, some measured responses, kind of what we saw April, after Israel, ramped up in Gaza. By measured response, I mean, they sent a bunch of drones. It took 2 hours for them to get to Israel. They sent, some cruise missiles, mostly that were brought down by either Iron Dome or the David Sling anti-ballistic missile array, and also some of their ballistic missiles, without much damage. I think that unfortunately there was one casualty that was an Arab girl that was killed in that whole thing. So they may attempt something like that again as kind of like a lackluster attempt to show that they're still in the game and they still care and they still hate Israel and want to destroy Israel. But I don't think when it comes down to it, Iran's especially going to do anything to risk their nuclear program for Hezbollah. I think they would betray Hezbollah in a heartbeat if it meant they get to keep their nukes. And maybe they'll just dial up the heat with the Houthis in Yemen. We haven't really seen them respond yet, or their groups in Iraq. We'll see how it turns out. Half of Lebanon army moonlights as Hezbollah fighters. Yes, there is a sizable proportion of the Lebanese population that is Shia, that serves in the armed forces, that also serves by the constitutional design in the government. Hezbollah is essentially a shadow government in Lebanon. They're not the official government, but they are definitely the most powerful party, the most powerful force behind the scenes. And the other Lebanese parties just don't have the clout and the muscle to be able to stand up to them at this point as much as they want to. And so again, different dynamics in that conflict compared to Gaza, but hopefully Israel can work together with the friendly factions and portions of the Lebanese government and society that are willing to work with them, even if they have to hold their nose, work with Israel to get rid of Hezbollah. Any update on Dalton? Having not seen or nor heard anything, I'm sorry. I don't have any updates on Dalton. Is Stephanie still in her home in the north praying for her safely? Yes, she is still home for now. I haven't had to evacuate yet. Doesn't look like, again, Hezbollah is in a position to mount any kind of cross-border raid at this point. So unlikely that especially that she would have to evacuate in the Golan Heights. It's kind of a different situation in the Golan compared to the Hula Valley and other parts of northern Galilee along the border. But at this point, everybody's still at home and they're just hunkered down. Good questions, guys. Wow. I'm behind. What about recent comments about Sinwar being killed or injured in recent strikes? I did address that a few minutes ago. It's still wait and see. Apparently the Israelis aren't even sure at this point if he's dead. All they know is that after a particular airstrike in the Gaza Strip, he stopped talking to his people in Qatar. Does that mean he's dead? Maybe. Does that mean he just went underground? He went off the grid altogether because the Israelis got too close to him, or who knows? We don't know yet. There's just no. Obviously, Hamas has not announced that, and there's just not enough evidence at this point, one way or the other. So we can bet that the Israelis are doing everything they can to answer that question as quickly as possible. My wife is in here chiming in on Stephanie. Thanks, babe. Expect the unexpected. Yes. My rule about the Middle East is the only thing you can expect is the unexpected. So let's avoid any hasty conclusions. And we're at this point now in the conflict with Hezbollah where it's kind of the fog of war, especially towards the beginnings of these things, and especially on social media where everybody has a voice in the public square. We're doing our best to curate the information that we're seeing. In general, what we do at The Wire is we use the biblical rule of needing to establish everything by the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's 2 or 3 separate witnesses, not one witness parroting what another one said, because that also happens where you get the telephone game. But if we see, especially something big that isn't officially confirmed by government channels, we want to see it independently verified by at least 2 different sources. So that's typically what we do. Doesn't always protect us 100% of the time from misinformation. But our other policy is if we're wrong, we will admit it. We'll walk it back. We'll follow up with an additional post. So I did that today with an airstrike that was targeting one of the top leaders of Hezbollah, the one that supposedly replaced the number 2 in Hezbollah's militia. Ali Akari, he was supposedly at a meeting that the Israeli Air Force hit with an airstrike earlier today, would be yesterday now in Israel. Appears at this point he was at least in the building and at least wounded, whether or not he was killed. At first it seemed almost confirmed that he was killed, and now we're starting to hear maybe he wasn't killed, and Hezbollah is denying it, and the Israeli government hasn't confirmed by now, which usually at this point they would announce that, unless it's really hard to tell, like it was with Mohammed Daif in Gaza. It took a few days to be sure. So he could be dead, he might not be. In the meantime, we try to share, if we're not certain, we try to share those types of posts, that kind of information with, it's being reported that, or this particular source claims that, without speaking in absolute terms. So fog of war, everybody's going to get it wrong sometimes, and if we just kind of follow our guidelines, our rules, and most of the time, hopefully, we're giving you good information, even if it's a little delayed, because we don't want to just automatically retweet and regurgitate everything that everybody's saying. We're also curating a lot of information on Telegram, which is even more of the Wild West than Twitter, if you can believe that. What will the Christians in Lebanon play in this conflict going forward? Well, that's a great question. We don't know. Maronite Christians have no love for Hezbollah. We'll say that. And there's also some Chaldean Catholics and other Christian groups in Lebanon. Christian militias worked together with the IDF during the Lebanese Civil War. Several leaders of the Lebanese Christian community have expressed their willingness to do so again. And really the tenor and the attitude, the public attitude that we see in Lebanon right now is very different this go around as it was compared to 2006, the second Lebanese Israeli war. In 2006, it was almost all sectors of Lebanese society were very closely united in opposition to the Israeli invasion. And the Israeli, which, by the way, was precipitated by Hezbollah kidnapping several Israeli soldiers along the border. So it wasn't like it was. It wasn't like they weren't provoked, but most of Lebanese society, the vast majority of Lebanese society, was opposed to Israeli intervention in that war and were standing with Hezbollah as a defender of the Lebanese people. 18 years later, that is not the case. As I said earlier, Lebanese society, the Lebanese government is in gridlock. The Lebanese economy is in a downward spiral. And the Lebanese just don't want a war right now. Most Lebanese people, I'd even venture to say most Lebanese Shia, don't want a war right now. Many of you remember the fertilizer explosion at the port of Beirut a couple of years ago that killed hundreds of people in downtown Beirut. And it was clear to everyone that Hezbollah was responsible for illegally storing that ammonium nitrate in the port in Beirut and in warehouses along the port of Beirut. So there's no love lost at this point, almost 2 decades later, for Hezbollah in Lebanese society. If you took a poll, probably most Lebanese people don't have any great love for Israel either. And so there's just this kind of sense of despair. Like, we don't want the war. We're not standing with Hezbollah. We're not standing with Israel. You might have some groups, such as the Maronite Christians, who are willing publicly to work with Israel if it came down to it against a common enemy. But there's not that kind of social fortitude in Lebanon that there was 18 years ago. So the two-horned ram from the book of Daniel says that it becomes so strong that no one can come against it. Do you think they're at that point? If you're referring to Iran or Persia in Daniel chapter 8, I'm not entirely convinced one way or the other that portion of Daniel 8 is future. And I know Joel has kind of been the one to kind of explore that prophecy over the course of the past few years. And he at one point was leaning towards the idea that it was future. That is the portion of the prophecy that has to do with the ram charging out in different directions from Persia, and then the one-horned goat coming down from Yavan, which, many Bibles translate that as Greece, but really Yavan included what we know today as the nation of Greece and the western coast of Turkey. Yavan charging across and shattering the horns of the ram and spreading out across the Middle East. And then the horn breaking off, which historically at least was the death of Alexander the Great. Whether that portion of the prophecy has a future application, I'm not sure. Because now at this point, Joel leans towards it not having a future application. And many of the prophecies of Daniel 8, Daniel 9, and then Daniel 10, 11, 12, all being kind of one prophecy, sort of have this recurring theme where they begin and we talked about this recently in the book of Revelation study, where they have this historical application that seems to be pretty much exclusively historical. And at some point in the prophecy, especially when it starts, usually the markers when it begins to refer to what Daniel calls either the little horn or the king of the north. At that point in the prophecy is when we believe that both the historical application and the future application begin to overlap with one another. And it's both future and history. And then at some point later in the prophecies, it seems that the historical application drops off altogether and it's just future. And we see this most clearly delineated in Daniel chapter 11, where the first 20 verses of the chapter don't have a future application. If they do, we have no idea how they could, because they're so detailed about particular historical figures. But then when we start talking about that final king of the north, then we start to get some more general details about the wars he fights and his hatred of the covenant and ultimately his invasion of the land and his desecration of the covenant. And then when you get to verse 35 through verse 40, none of that has any historical application. Antiochus Epiphanes was drawn away to the east to fight a war. He didn't return in tents, in his palatial tents, as it says in Daniel 11, to the Jezreel Valley, the Valley of Armageddon. He didn't fight a huge third war against his adversaries and overflow into many countries. So we know that part of the prophecy is not at all historical, because there's no historical parallel there. And so at this point, and I could be wrong, at this point I tend to believe that that Daniel 8 follows that same sort of pattern of there's kind of a purely historical narrative, and then maybe a portion that overlaps, and we start getting into the portion of the prophecy that discusses the little horn, and then purely future. So whether or not the ram charging out or the goat charging down from the north are part of any future event is remains to be seen. I would say that we're not at that. I would not personally interpret Iran's work through its proxies as a ram charging out. I think if something like that were to happen, it would be much more blatantly obvious than that. Could be wrong, but that's my somewhat dangerously informed opinion. So a good question, though. That's an important thing to consider, and we get that question a lot, right? You know, how does this event relate to this? How does this event relate to that? We just don't know yet. There aren't many very clear markers, prophetically speaking, for us to be looking for at this point. Besides that 10-nation coalition and the covenant with death, that covenant that comes in the last 7, as Daniel says in chapter 9, and the rise of that little horn. Whether or not we'll be able to recognize all of those things happening, even as they start to happen, is yet to be seen. We just aren't given enough detail. It's very broad strokes for the first half of the 70th week of Daniel. It's fairly broad. We have an idea of where to look and what to look for, but we don't have specifics. It gets specific with the abomination that causes desolation at the midpoint of the week, the beginning of the Great Tribulation. That's what Jesus says in Matthew 24. Look for this. When you see this specific event happen in this specific place, then you know 1,290 days, times and half a time. Right? So that's the marker ultimately that we're looking for. What happens before that, we have some general sense of this man arising and where he's going to rise from, and the coalition he's going to form, and the deal he's either going to make or affirm, and the initial wars he's going to fight against the kings of the south. Other than that, we just see the dynamics kind of unfolding, right? We definitely see the dynamics. If you watched my Book of Revelation session on the post-October 7th, how close are we to the beast empire, we definitely see that north-south dynamic already at play in the Middle East. We already see the ships of Kittim doing the best they can to kind of restrain things in the region, and kind of play the middle ground as much as possible, probably more on the side of Israel than not, but at trying to tamp down on conflict at least as much as possible and maintain the status quo. All those are Daniel 11 dynamics. So that tells me we're on the horizon. Thank you for praying for Marco and on the Israelis. They appreciate that. Any news on Covenant Controversy Part 4? I had the pleasure of being a part of that project. I'm unfortunately, maybe one of these days, I'll get to be more involved in those productions. I love doing them, but I'm not really qualified to do anything else other than talk in front of the camera. So I don't really have any details at this point on when the film is going to be released. I know it's in post-production. Steph and Mark Ash are working feverishly, but we shot a lot all over the place, and there's a lot of B-roll footage to go through, and it takes time. And unfortunately, we don't have as large of a studio as we would like to churn those things out, and so Mark and Steph are leading that charge, and hopefully early next year. Don't quote me. That's what I hope to see, but I don't have a date yet, or even a clear picture of the time frame. Are we heading towards the fulfillment of Isaiah 17? I know you don't love to make predictions, but the Lord keeps putting on my heart to pray for Damascus. By all means, please pray for Damascus. The context of Isaiah 17 appears, if you read through the whole chapter, to be eschatological. So the kind of destruction that we see described in Isaiah chapter 17, I don't know that we're necessarily going to see before the Great Tribulation, before the day of the Lord. We could. There are some events described in Isaiah chapter 19, for instance, in regards to Egypt, especially regards to the Nile water supply, that if you follow the wire again, you might know what's going on with Ethiopia and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, threatening the Egyptian water supply. That's happening even now. That's something described in Isaiah 19. So whether we're beginning to see some of these things fulfilled, whether we're beginning to see them hinted at, I would tend to lean mostly towards the Lord pointing to those things more than a fulfillment. I think when we see the Lord on the ground in the Scripture, or when we see Him being revealed and fighting against those nations, we're talking the day of the Lord. We're talking eschatological. We're not talking, pre-Great Tribulation especially. But by all means, don't let that hold you back from praying for the people of Syria. They certainly need it. Praying for peace. Yep, you are welcome. Where's Turkey going to end up in all of this? I addressed that earlier. Unclear. Turkey's probably keeping its distance from the Hezbollah conflict, at least right now. Erdogan, another point to make is, on one hand, Erdogan likes to flex his muscles, at least verbally, against Israel at every opportunity and play himself as sort of the Ottoman champion of the Palestinians. At the same time, though, technically Turkey still has diplomatic relations with Israel. They've been, sanctioning Israel and boycotting Israel, but they still technically have they have ambassadors with each other. I could still take a Turkish Airlines flight from Istanbul to Tel Aviv, and I just did earlier this year. So Turkey hasn't completely cut Israel off, and at times other times, Erdogan kind of likes to play himself as the middleman, as the peacemaker. Well, I'll be the one to sit down with all the parties and make the peace. My army can go in and occupy Gaza after the war is over, like Israel would ever allow that. But, I'll help negotiate a Palestinian state in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So he kind of talks out of both sides of his mouth, where he condemns Israel, but at the same time he wants to be the peacemaker, And that's the thing that a lot of Middle Eastern leaders do to kind of puff up their clout, is I'm the one that can come in and settle these things. Whether or not he personally is going to have any kind of role in a peace agreement, we shall see. I think future starts. My wife texted me and told me to wrap it up. So sorry, guys. Boss's orders. But I'll take a couple more questions. Can't believe how fast Jewish hate is becoming mainstream. God bless Israel and the Jewish people. Yes, that has been one of the most surreal aspects of this whole conflict over the past 11 months. Is the day after 1,200 Israelis were literally slaughtered at a music festival and in their homes, and 200 of them were kidnapped, and GoPro videos began to hit social media, literally showing them being raped and tortured and murdered. The day after that, you had marches in the streets against Israel across the world, in the streets of Europe and New York and Chicago and LA and in Australia, not to mention the Middle East. So that is certainly one of the more baffling aspects of this whole thing, isn't it? Is it's really this sort of delusion, that this spell that many in the world are under, that it doesn't matter how much evidence you give them. It doesn't matter if you show them the Hamas guys filmed this. They're the ones saying this, not Israel, not the Mossad, not the IDF. Not the American government, not Bibi. It's Hamas is saying they did this. Oh, that's just IDF propaganda. I've had Christians tell me, professing evangelical Christians tell me that's just Hamas propaganda. So it blows your mind. And yet, again, this is exactly what the Lord said would happen. This is exactly the heavy stone and the sort of drunken stupor that he prophesied through Zechariah in Zechariah 12 through 14. So we knew this is coming. And yet when you actually see it begin to unfold, it's no less shocking and surprising and amazing to see it actually happening. So, Cora J, do I think the future starts earlier than Daniel 11:21-9? Yes, I would say it starts with Daniel 11:21. The first verse that has to do with that man, the final king of the north. All right, so rapid fire. Here, I'll click off a couple more. You're welcome to those saying thank you. I appreciate the encouragement. We have an imposter among us. Well, always going to be some trolls. So, all right, guys. I think I've droned on long enough. Hopefully this is, as we've been working through kind of the technical issues there, and I apologize for that, but hopefully this was edifying and encouraging for you. It's a little bit of a pilot to see how this goes. We might polish it up a little bit next time, but you might remember after October 7th when I was in Italy with my family, I was doing almost daily updates on my phone, and that kind of worked, at least for the time being, right? But now, since I'm home with all the gear, I'm in a little bit better of a position to do regular reporting for the Wire. So I'm going to stick with you on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. If you're not on X, might not be a bad idea to join and at least follow us there. If a lot of people ask us, who do you trust? Well, we for the most part, repost the sources that we trust. And a lot of you I've seen have now followed those same sources and are reposting them as well. So that's kind of the idea, is we kind of hand off our trusted sources to you and kind of crowdsource this thing. So follow us on X. I'll kind of debrief with Steph and the team and see how this went and see if we're going to keep doing it. But as things continue to ramp up in the days ahead, we are definitely going to continue to pump out more video content for you on the Wire. In between Book of Revelation and Matthew 24:14 commitments that I have. So for better or worse, you're going to see my face more often probably in the coming days. Otherwise, love you all. Thanks for sticking it out, all 120 of you. Blessings to you, and Maranatha.